Thanks everybody for being here. We have 123 screens open, which is a lot of people to hear your story, Myrna. Thank you for sharing, thank you in advance for sharing your story with us, which I've had a little advanced glimpse into, and I have to say there's a lot of very interesting stuff here. And we're going to try to condense 83 years of life into about 35 or 40 minutes. So let's see how that goes. Let's see the corsage, first of all. I saw it on your wrist. There you go.
Yeah, yeah.
So is your actual birthday around now?
My birthday is in March.
In March, close enough.
So I'm old. I'm older than 83 in a few months.
Yeah, well, you're still holding up after several months, I guess. So thanks so much for again sharing your story with us. I want to start with where you grew up. You grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, and tell us a little bit about what was that like? What was the environment like? What was who were some of your neighbors? What was it? What did it feel like? How did you how did you navigate in that environment at that time when you were growing up?
Well, it was a very tough but protective environment. Everybody that I knew 2 or 3 blocks around me, everybody was Jewish. And you had eyes on the street. People looked after you. I lived in a building with 6 apartments. 4 of them were family. The other 2 were landsmen. So it was a one big family kind of thing. And, the good news is that you had someone all the time to play with as a kid. You had someone to eat with. I would go from apartment to apartment to see who had the best food for dinner. And it was comfortable. It really was comfortable. The doors were unlocked. The other part, as one of my kids said, but you had no privacy, Mom. Nope. Did not even think about privacy. It wasn't within the framework. You just lived together and cared for each other. And although it was a tough neighborhood, and I mean tough, it was a neighborhood that respected you if you were not one of the gangs or criminals. So it was easy for us, but because we weren't one of the gangs or criminals. And you know that Neil lived almost directly across the street from me, and I didn't know him until he was going to his prom. It was so congested. I mean, we had so many people. You'd go outside to play anything, and you could. I mean, there were people to play with you. And my family was very kind of large. I had 2 gorgeous redheaded cousins who lived in the building. And so compared to them, I was kind of, and I took them with me to go to theaters in New York City and sit close to the first row because they would get the attention of whoever was on the stage. They had such carrot red hair. And it was, I mean, I knew I had a way to cash in with them. So it was wonderful. I loved it.
The world is a better place that you did not get lured into organized crime early in life.
Nope.
We're glad about that. Tell us a little bit about your parents. Where were they born? When did they make their way? They were not born in the United States. When did they make their way over to the U.S.? What was their story and their experience?
My mother and father were both born in Ukraine in different villages. My father was born in Tolchin, which was a place where they made uniforms for the Cossacks and for the Tsar's army. He came over in 1904, so he doesn't have much of a memory except negative about that. My mother was born in Berdichev, and that word Berdichev should sort of evoke the Berdichevo Rebbe. It was a town of, I don't know how many people, but 80% of the population was Jewish. So you just surrounded by it. And this is a a little fact that you probably don't have to know, but I think it's so interesting. All the police records and the court records were in Yiddish. That's how this little town lived. And Neil and I went there with the Privens a few decades ago, and we peered into one of the houses that looked empty, and it was just what my father and mother told me. Their houses were a big room, curtained off for bedding, for sleeping, like on shelves, a place where you cooked, a place where you sat around a table, and a goat in the yard. And it was a goat in this yard that where we were peering in, but it was just what my parents told me, and a dirt floor. My mother used to say, I don't like the old country. It's full of mud and dirt. And she never romanticized about the old country, ever. Neither did my father. My mother came over in 1906, came over with large families. And it was really interesting. They wouldn't talk much about the old country because they said it was unpleasant. They left part of their family in Ukraine. And as a matter of fact, they were all murdered by the rest of the family was murdered by the Nazis in 1941. Some of them at Babi Yar. So there's a history, and I guess I absorbed some of that history.
And even in addition to not really speaking well or much at all about the experience of the old country, as you put it, they didn't speak Yiddish to you in the house. That's right.
No, I tried to speak Yiddish to my bubby, and she would say, Mindel, speak English. I understand your English better than your Yiddish. So I never really learned the Yiddish that I should have learned.
But they didn't speak it, you think, because they wanted you to assimilate or become part of the U.S., or I think you mentioned to me they didn't want you to speak it because they wanted a secret language that they could speak.
That's exactly right. It was their secret language.
Yeah.
And I didn't even, I didn't think about it. It was their language, and we would try to listen in. My brother and I would try to listen in. My brother is 9 years older than I am. He's 91 now. He's amazing. I'm so proud of him. So, and it was a good, I didn't have to. I knew Hebrew. I learned Hebrew when I was in first grade. I went to a Talmud Torah, but before that, my parents had gotten a scholarship for me to go to a Beis Yaakov, which is a girls' yeshiva, all the way over on the other side of Brooklyn in Williamsburg. And the night before, my bubby said to me, "It's so great, you're gonna go to yeshiva and you'll be a Rebbitzin." And it stopped me in my tracks. Bubby, I don't want to be a Rebbitzin, I want to be a Rebbe. And she said, "You can't." And I refused to go to a school that would make me into a Rebbitzin. So I went to public school, not Beis Yaakov. So I don't even know what happened to that scholarship, but the whole family worked to get me that scholarship, and I disappointed them. I mean, I just wouldn't accept the Rebbitzin role and not the Rebbe role.
To be a rabbi's wife.
Oh yeah, Rebbitzin is a rabbi's wife.
Right.
No way.
Right.
I mean, be a rabbi's wife, but not at the expense of being I wanted to be a Rebbe too.
That wasn't in the realm of imagination even at the time, right?
It wasn't, but I imagined it.
Go ahead.
I would walk, I think it was 8 blocks, to go to a shul and a Talmud Torah every Shabbos morning. I was in love with Yiddishkeit, with prayer, I loved it. And so for me, I wanted to be like that rabbi, not like the Rebbitzin. And I didn't know any Rebbitzins either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just skipping back a couple of notches, you talked about family left behind in Ukraine. Many of them lost their lives in the Shoah. You mentioned, you had mentioned to me a very distinct memory you had. One day you heard your grandmother, your bubby, scream. This was in the mid 40s, and a memorable sound that resounded and maybe had something to do, all this experience had something to do with what you did later in life. But tell us about that scene.
My Bubby's apartment was one floor below us. We lived up on the top floor. She lived in the middle, and my uncles lived all around us. And on Sunday morning, they would come and see her. That was sort of de rigueur, you know. They would come. Those who didn't live right in the building would come from their neighborhoods to see her. And suddenly there was a scream that I still hear. And my mother, father, and I ran downstairs to see Bubby. And my uncles were there, and they had just told her that the family was murdered and by the Nazis. And it was a turning point in her life and in mine. That scream still, I can hear it. And I didn't know, I was only like 6 or 7 years old. I didn't know what happened, but I knew that it was terrible. And that's what it was. I mean, I think it did sit in my memory to the point where I became, and you know that, became a Holocaust scholar. I spent my adult life devoted to the Holocaust, to remembering the Holocaust, and feeling that they were murdered once, and I didn't want them to be forgotten, which would have been like a second murder. So I devoted myself to their memories and wrote about them, and that's it. I did that.
You talked also about briefly about a 16-year-old cousin named Jean, who was part of the family. He had lived through the war in France, in Paris, and he came to visit right after the war, in 1946.
Actually, we brought him over. We tried to bring over him and his sisters, but his older sisters were apparently not, they just couldn't make the break from Paris. So they sent Jean, and Jean was, how old was I? I was a kid, and he was my height, and he had gray teeth. And my Bubby offered him a bottle of milk, a glass of milk from a bottle of milk, and he took the bottle and he chug-a-lugged it immediately. He was so starved for food. Jean went on to go to Ohio State, become an architect and so on. But his sisters never came over. They just wouldn't do it. But, you know, Hayas was the intervening agency that brought him over. We were in touch with Hayas. Hayas was in touch with us. And the whole family gathered when we took Jean from the airport to my Bubby's house. The whole family was there. Yeah.
So you also didn't mention that your father was a bus driver.
Yes.
On the public buses, worked, you said 6 days a week. So
Six and a half.
Six and a half, sorry, yeah. So it was a very modest upbringing. Your mother was a homemaker, was at home taking care of the home front. So there wasn't, there weren't a lot of resources for you to
No.
do a lot of things, to buy things. Tell us just about that experience. And, you know, I'm sure that everybody around you was sort of in the same situation, so everything's relative, right?
Some more, some, I don't know about less, but there were some more people. You just didn't, you never asked for things that you knew you couldn't get. I never heard my parents say, we can't afford that. You just knew not to ask, and we didn't. We just didn't. But I do remember one thing that warms me when I think about it. One day in 7th grade, I came home and there were 2 beautiful skirts on the bed, on my bed. And those were the first clothes that I had that were bought and not handed down. And I was ecstatic. These were beautiful skirts. I wore them until they were shredded. But it was the kind of thing that, you know, you lived not getting things. You lived with people. And my mother, by the way, was a wonderful, wonderful cook and baker. So she always had, the relatives always came because Faye cooked, my mother cooked, and her baking was marvelous. Neil can attest to that. So, yeah, it was, I didn't know I had such a wonderful childhood. I just took it for granted until I thought about it. And I thought about, not having this, that, and the other thing. It didn't matter. It really didn't matter.
So instead of going to the girls' yeshiva, which would have been a whole other path to whatever, Rebbitzin or Rabbi, we don't know, you ended up in public school. You were a very good student. You loved school, you told me. And then the time came to go to college. You were, you were at the ripe age of 16 and a half, I think, when you went to college. And your choice, you had several choices, but two choices.
Yes.
Which were?
I could go to secretarial school, or I could go to college. And if I go to college, I have to be a teacher because teachers can be with their kids in the summer. I mean, those are my choices. My uncles who lived in the building and my bubby said she has to go to secretarial school so she could go to work and bring money into the house. That's the way it was in those days. And my mother fought my uncles. I will never forget the arguments they had in the hallway, upstairs and downstairs, yelling, nope, she's going to go to college. And so she won, and I went to college. The first day of college, I went to CCNY, and probably the main reason I went to CCNY was because Neil was there. He was studying engineering for a short while, then he went into chemistry. And we could go to school together, except when he had 8 o'clock labs, I would not go to school with him because it was an hour and a half by subway to get from my house to the college. And I wouldn't get up that early, not even for him. So at that time. So yes, we came home every night. We had I read on the subway. City College, I think you're gonna ask me, what was it like?
Yes, I am.
City College was intimidating. It was political. People, my students, my peers, would go into the cafeteria and they would start arguments about Heidegger, about every philosopher you could think of and every writer you could think of. And that would go on for hours. You could go and get your food, which was usually, by the way, go to class because the food, you normally brought your sandwiches for lunch. It was called the poor man's Harvard, or Harvard on the Hudson. And, so we would argue, and then we'd go to class and we'd come back and finish the arguments. And that could go on all day long. And it was kind of amazing to me that people knew so much. I mean, I had never argued about Tolstoy or any of that stuff, or Heidegger. It was amazing to me, but it was a lesson. It was learning, and it made me want to know more. And I just loved. I went through college in 3.5 years. I had to go to the School of Education because my mother said so. and I minored in English. And I loved it. It was just a great place to be with all the awareness of what was going on. This was the 50s and McCarthyism and all that. And you can imagine the students at CCNY had a lot to say, a lot.
Right.
And they would stand on tables to say it. And I learned a lot from them. I learned that I could be intimidated and still move on, because they were very intimidating students. They were so smart. And
part of what was intimidating, and out of that, environment came a lot of very famous public intellectuals and scientists and so forth. Many of them Jews.
Nobel Prize winners. We had many Nobel Prize winners out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was famous for that. But the other thing you mentioned to me was that you were in the first class where women were able to take classes with men. And so part of what was intimidating, you told me, is that being a woman in that environment was tough.
It was invisible. But Neil reminded me, he did the research and reminded me that I was in the second class of women. So, but the faculty still was not used to having women in their classes. And they didn't ever call on women. You were just passed over. I didn't speak, and I didn't know I could have a voice really until I was out of college, because there were men who only called on men. And these were some of the faculty at CCNY were very famous scholars, and it was a tough school. I don't know how to describe it, but it was hard. Let me say this, the first day of college, we all got together in a magnificent Gothic hall, and whoever spoke to us, a dean or whoever, said, look to your left, look to your right. In 1 year, they will be gone. And that's exactly how it was. It was so hard. And I did a lot of homework. And I felt as though I had a lot of making up to do, because they had read more books than I had. And that, I thought, how could that be? But they did. And the books they read were kind of red baiting books. So, okay. Yeah.
Well, I have a feeling we'll talk about this later. You more than caught up with them later on. Let's talk about, you mentioned Neil, and you've known Neil since you were, am I right, 14 years old?
Yes, since I was 14.
Yeah, and he, as you said, he lived in the neighborhood, but you didn't really know that until a little bit later. And how did you connect with him? What was the courting experience? Tell us about that.
Yeah, flirting, did you say? It was
courting.
It was the finals week. I was coming home from my high school, by the way. Thomas Jefferson had 1,900 students in the graduating class, so it was big. Yeah. And also, by the way, I had a close relationship with Mr. Jaffe, who was a history teacher and who ran the high school bookstore. So I helped him in the bookstore, and I bought books at that point that were way above my head, but they were wonderful. I mean, and he encouraged me, and we talked about the front page of the New York Times. And also, a lot of my teachers in junior high and high were vets, World War II veterans. And so they were fresh, they were excited about teaching people how to think, teaching kids to get involved. It was really exciting. And
Neil
was my favorite. But anyway, where was I?
Neil.
Oh, yeah. Oh, how can I not be there? He was walking home from the laundry, which was on the way between our high school and our street. And I was on the way home from a final exam. And so we started to walk together, and lo and behold, we kept walking together. I mean, we found out that we lived across the street from each other. And that was the beginning. I think that the following Friday night, we met at the movies, right, Neil? And the whole neighborhood would meet in the back of the theater, the movie theater, where there was a candy stand. And you went in and paid for yourself, but you met your boyfriend at the candy stand. And well, we didn't have any money, so that's how it went. And we started to, at that time they called it going steady. And we went steady. And we even went to, his first time he asked me for a real date was he had an assignment in one of his classes to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he asked me if I would like to go also with him. And of course, I was in love with him even at that time. And if he would have asked me to go to Timbuktu, I would have, I'm sure, done that too. But it was simply But you did that once a week. You went to the movies. I don't know what we saw or anything like that, um, but that's how we got together until he got a summer job, and he actually took me out to the movies downtown, and even sometimes for an ice cream soda. Remember? And we would stop and have an ice cream soda before we came home.
Well, he didn't take you to Timbuktu, but you got married right after graduation at CCNY, and you went to Arkansas.
Yes,
This may be about, as big of a culture uh, clash or culture, what do you call it, break as going to Timbuktu from Brooklyn, but he was in grad school there. You were teaching in a small school, teaching elementary education in a small school. And, it was an interesting experience for somebody who grew up in this environment in Brooklyn where everybody was Jewish pretty much. And then you were working in a place where nobody was Jewish and you were the only one. That was an experience.
true. In that town, Springdale, Arkansas, nobody was Jewish.
Hmm.
And I got the job to teach there because the superintendent of that system, if you could call it a system anyway, the superintendent had once heard the superintendent of schools in in New York. His name was something Jansen, and he was so impressed that he said anyone who was in that district, that environment, had to be a good teacher. So he gave me a job, and my first class was 49 students. My very first class.
That's a big class.
Grade, 49 students.
Yeah.
And they said that came Christmas time, I had to decorate the room. That was the custom. And I didn't know how to start. I knew that I could not have a creche. I mean, I just couldn't do that. So I told my class, we're going to do it Disney style. I don't know if I use the word Disney, but we had all the figures that the comics and so on. And we had very secular decorations. And two of the parents, they sort of liked me, and they brought in 2 Christmas trees. Both of them were cedar trees, and we had to decorate them. We did it with the popcorn, with nothing religious. And then it was getting very odd. I was getting uncomfortable because the people from the town would come to the door. There was a window in my door to the classroom, and they peeked in to see the Jewish teacher. And so I was a specimen, I suppose. But it didn't matter because anyway, my class and I won the school prize for the best decorated Christmas.
There you go. Yeah.
And I thought that was so perfect, and we got, it was an important prize. We got $50 to spend on school supplies for the class. And that was good. That was very, very good.
So when you were in Arkansas, you were also in school. While you were teaching, you were in school getting a graduate degree, and then you ended up moving to Dayton, Ohio for
Yep.
Neil's job. And that's where all 3 of your children were born.
Yes.
Right? I should say you had something to do with them being born. You were there at the time. And you were involved in civil rights activities.
We marched. We went on every march in Dayton, and we were very close to Father Kelly, who was the head of the University of Dayton. I think he was the head, or anyway, a faculty member. He was a dean. And we had Catholic-Jewish relations, and Neil proffered a Seder for the nuns in a convent. And the funny thing about that is they asked me what to do, what to get, all that kind of stuff. And they said they had a very funny experience buying Manischewitz wine because the wine merchant said, "Are you sure, sisters, you really want that?" So when we got to the convent, the tables were all set up, and I had 3 kids under the age of 4 then. And they were there, obviously I couldn't leave them anywhere. So we looked at the tables, and on each table, there was a plate with white bread. No one told them no bread. They had the matzah. They had the gefilte fish. They had everything you need. They had charoses. and they had white bread.
Yeah.
And I said, sisters, we can't have any bread. The matzah replaces the bread.
Yeah.
That was a fun experience. I
Yeah.
mean, it was really nice, you know, but we were just very active in interfaith kind of things.
Mhm. And then, so I'm trying to move it along a little bit, but sorry to jump too much. You then moved to New Jersey. Neil took a teaching job, an academic job at Farley Dickinson, there teaching, and then later you all made your way to the Washington, D.C. area when he took a job at the Atomic Energy Commission,
Yes.
1967. You were also involved in civil rights activities here, very involved. And then you ended up, in addition to raising your children, that's when you began your relationship with Montgomery College. Maybe you can tell us kind of how that progressed, how that came about, how it progressed, what you did at Montgomery College.
Well, in 1970 and 71, there was an influx of female students, and they didn't have enough faculty. So I heard about it and I applied, and I got the job. And not only me, but a whole bunch of us came in at the same time. And it was a marvelous opportunity to meet people who needed encouragement. And, you know, community college students are not the wealthiest, not even in the upper middle class, usually. And what I did in that job, and I was also the department chair and all that kind of stuff, but I decided that the students really didn't understand how close they lived to downtown Washington, and most of them never went downtown. So I decided I applied at the NEH, National Endowment, and I got a grant to develop a partnership with the Smithsonian. And we were partnered with the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress, and I had to get money to be able to pay for the 3 credits that my students who qualified to go down there and learn from a curator would get. And at one point, I had to go back to one of my donors. I had to go back and say, listen, my students don't have enough money for the lunches downtown. It's not cheap. And I needed, you know, a few $1,000s more. And they wrote the check. But some of the people that I got money from, you know, it was a grant. It was a matching grant. And I think it came up to $5 million. I'm not sure. And I had 5 years to be able to do it, to raise that money. And I did. And it was named after the biggest donor. I had to do that, Paul Peck. And we developed a humanities center. It was the Paul Peck Humanities Center. And I ran that program until I retired, and it is still going on. And then I said, you know, the students are getting everything from that. The curators were very, very, if you were applying to a 4-year college from a 2-year college, and you had a recommendation from a curator at the Smithsonian, you got in. I mean, that was a ticket. And so it was very good. Before that, I had gotten grants from Ford Foundation to integrate women and minorities into community colleges all over the country. I had done a lot of work like that. And some of the colleges were Native American. And in one college, a Chippewa college in North Dakota, they held a powwow for Neil and me. I had no idea what a real powwow was. It was a huge room. It was hundreds of people. And what I organized for them was to have the tribes hear the elders of that tribe tell the others the history. And these women yelled at these younger people for not keeping the traditions, for not having enough pride, for letting themselves drink too much. I mean, it was electrifying to hear that. And the students were amazing. You know, the rest of the community was amazed at that. And what I wound up doing is getting some more money from the Ford Foundation so we could put that we could transcribe it into books, so they would have a written history as well as an oral history. And I did that. I went also to historically Black community colleges, and one of them was in California, LA. And we have a cousin who lives in LA who was a cop at that time. And when I went there to LA to work with the faculty, he said, "You're not going there. I won't let you go there without an escort. Do you know what you're going into?" So we had a police escort take us to that college, and I taught. The faculty never taught these students their own Black history, and I said, this can't go, and I worked with them to develop a curriculum that had Black history and Black literature. The Black literature is so rich. I mean, I couldn't believe they didn't know it. So anyway, that started that, and I did that essentially all over the country. And I also did that in the state a few years before that. So it's kind of interesting that I spent a lot of my time as a teacher, not teaching students, but teaching teachers. And I think it made a difference.
And you also were the head of the English department at Montgomery College.
Yes, and I had
73 full-time people.
Yeah.
Say that again, because 73
full-timers.
Yeah, right. So that's a big job. That's a very big job.
Having a party for my department in my house was an undertaking.
Yeah,
it really was.
Well, let's transition a bit. I mean, while you're doing all this, you're beginning to study more and teach about Holocaust studies, about the Holocaust, which
yes.
Was very much a part of your life, as you said already. And you said, you wrote in something you sent me, I became aware of the moral burden it brought. As the more you read, the more you taught, I became aware of the moral burden of the Holocaust. Talk about what grabbed you, how you made your transition into Holocaust studies.
Well, Neil, I was on a sabbatical to write my dissertation, and Neil had to go on a trip to Vienna to the International AEC, Atomic Energy Commission. And I said, I'd like to go because I have this time I don't have to teach, in a sabbatical. And I wanted to go see Auschwitz. And Neil had he had such clearance that they wouldn't let him or me go behind the Iron Curtain. Because at that time it was behind the Iron Curtain. This was in the early 80s.
In Poland, across the border, yeah. Yes,
and so they said, okay, you at the end of Neil's work week, you can go to Birkenau. Not Birkenau, Mauthausen.
Mauthausen.
And it was February, very cold, and after his week of work, the embassy gave us a car with the little flags on it, it was so important, right? And we drove to, it was 102 miles, we drove to Mauthausen. And that changed my life. And it had an impact on everybody's life and who was in my life. We had the briefing book that the embassy gave us, and we were going according to the briefing book. And we were in several buildings and so on. And we saw torture sites and all the horrible things. And then I walked alone into a room that chilled me. It was about 10 by 15, I'm not exactly sure. It was white tiled most of the way up with blue stains on the wall, and the blue stains. And I looked up and there were shower heads, and I knew not to look down because I would be looking for a drain. And I later found out there was one drain, but there were 16 shower heads, and they were gas shower heads. This is not where they got showered. This was the gas chamber. And the next thing I remember was I was in a different building. Neil said I was screaming. He came to get me. Well, you'd be screaming too, if you're in the gas chamber. And And we walked into another building, but I cannot remember any of that. I just remember in that other building, I went to the bathroom, I was in a stall, and I was afraid to come out because I was sure there'd be a woman guard ready to take me to a barracks. I was so traumatized. And we got back, no more sightseeing there. We went back to Vienna wordlessly. We had planned to stop for coffee mid-schlag, on the way back. But we went back a almost 2-hour drive, a beautiful drive, by the way. But we said nothing. And at night, every time I closed my eyes to go to sleep, I was in the gas chamber. And it took me quite a few weeks to overcome being in the gas chamber and to be willing to go to sleep. And then I said to myself, this can't go on. I'm paralyzed by this traumatic experience. And so I said, oh, what I do, and I do well, I knew that, was teach. And so I immersed myself in Holocaust history and literature that was written in English. I couldn't read the German books, obviously, but I could read all the English books, and it wasn't that hard. There were not many books, really not many books on the Holocaust in English.
This is the early 1980s, maybe? Or
pardon me?
This is like the 1980s or?
Early 80s.
Okay.
And I also taught the Holocaust at Hopkins at night. And when I assigned books to my classes, the students told me they couldn't get the books because they weren't in the library. That was the time when Hopkins switched from department libraries to a central library. And the German department, which would have had or should have had all the books about the Holocaust, didn't. So the librarian, I sent him my syllabus. The librarian called me and he said, I'm going to buy every single book that's on the syllabus and every book you want me to buy. And I'll keep buying the new ones every year. And he did. He actually, I never met the man, but the next years and the years after that, all those books were in the library and my students had access to them. So I get emotional when I talk about that, the Holocaust and that experience at Mauthausen. But I spent many years teaching, and in fact, I taught as a scholar in residence in a few colleges. And I had a lot of encouragement from my college president who would say to me, I would say to him, I have an idea. And he would say, good, let's talk about it. And he'd say, okay, so how are we going to implement it? How do we make it happen? And we would work together and we made things happen. It was just amazing. It was simply amazing.
And then you made a transition while you were immersing yourself in all this scholarship, this Holocaust scholarship. You began to see, you mentioned a couple of names of scholars at the Holocaust Museum. You were with Sybil Milton and Joan Ringelheim, who I think are maybe well known to some people around here. And you and they noticed that there were very few narratives written about or by women,
right? That were in print.
The Holocaust, that were in print. That was an obvious, absence for you, and that pointed you in a certain direction, didn't it?
Yes. I also started the Women's Studies program at Montgomery College. So I was focused on women in literature, women in history, so on and so forth. And I noticed that there were no women, you couldn't get anything on women in the Holocaust. And I know that women were half the internees, half the prisoners. And because men and women are biologically different, they had different experiences. So Joan and Sybil and I set out to make a difference. And I began to give papers, and they did too, and they wrote. Both of them mentored me. It was beautiful. wrote about women. And I gave papers a lot, and eventually, at conferences. It's interesting that in the 80s, you knew everyone in America and some people in England and some in Germany who were Holocaust scholars. The field was so small. And you know something about that happened to me. I picked up one day, commentary appeared on my desk in Montgomery College, and
the magazine commentary, yeah.
Yes, and I saw on the cover it had Auschwitz and the Allies as one of the articles. It came during finals week, so I had no time to look at it. But after finals week, I opened up the article, and it was the manager, the editor of commentary, who took me and 6 other feminist scholars to task for trivializing the scholarship by writing about women. And yes, you're shaking your head, some of you, yes. And he named me in particular, and he misquoted me. And I wrote him back, and I told him what the quote was, and he apologized and put that in the next issue of commentary. So I felt vindicated. But meanwhile, there was also the same article, he published it in the Wall Street Journal. So it was like notorious, and we answered him, and we stuck to our guns, and we opened the field called Gender and the Holocaust. And you have to recognize that men and women, when they went to the camps, were separated. So a man's experience at any camp could not be translated into a woman's experience, simply because they were not in the same place. And the Nazis treated men and women equally horribly. I mean, I wrote a paper called Different Horrors, Same Hell. And I wrote a book with that title. And I had to find out what the horrors were for women. Women gave birth in the camps, because when they were deported, they were in their early pregnancies. And no man could write about what it was like to give birth in Auschwitz, and so on. And so I just wrote a lot, and I spoke a lot, and eventually the Azrieli Foundation in Canada called me and said, we'd like you to look at 50 memoirs under 50 pages each and make a book out of it. And these were all women who were in the camps who emigrated to Canada. And that book won the National Jewish Book.
Canadian.
Neil? What?
Canadian Jewish Book Award or something.
Yeah, right. And they brought me to Toronto, and they brought me to Montreal, and it was a big deal. It was very nice. My book went everywhere, and I won the Independent Publishers Award. I didn't win, the book won, and it got a mention.
It was finalist.
A finalist in the National Jewish Book Award competition. And I haven't been able to write. That was 2017, and I've been so busy with that book and going places and speaking that I haven't been able to write the book I want to write next.
But how many books have you written?
3 that I have edited and written.
4.
4. Bill just said 4. Yeah, 4. I don't keep track.
Okay. And lots of journal articles, I'm sure.
Dozens and dozens. Yeah.
A number of years ago, I remember speaking with Michael Berenbaum, who was one of the foundational people at the Holocaust Museum, and I remember he said that they used to have to limit the amount of time that people in the in the collections were spending with the material, because psychologically it could be very difficult. How did you deal with emotionally with sifting through all of this very difficult information?
Well, it's what I did was connect with my peers. We didn't see each other often because we only went to conferences, 2 or 3 times a year where we could meet, but we kept close contact with each other. And you couldn't talk about your feelings with the other faculty. They had no idea what you were dealing with.
Yeah.
And people don't even know the horrors that the Jews went through. We can't write about all of them. And then I kept saying to myself, they can't die twice, so I have to write about them. And I became very close friends with the Holocaust survivors in Washington and Greater Washington. I was their member the secretary of membership. And they kept telling me, go to all these camps, yes, but every time you go, make sure you go out and have a good meal with your husband and dance if you can. Otherwise, the Nazis would have won. And so, you make yourself. I remember going to a conference in Berlin at the Berlin Technical University or something. And I was we went to the Einstein Cafe afterwards in the center of Berlin, and walking home, it was around 11, 12 o'clock at night, and it was drizzling. But I walked home and said to I screamed, we won. You did not push us down. We did win. And it just came out spontaneously because we won. And we're going on, and Jewish people will go on.
There's a lot of very encouraging commentary on the chat here, just thanking you for your story and really saying how amazing your work has been. And one of the things I wanted to sort of come in for a landing here with to talk about your 3 children who are on now.
They are the best things that ever happened to me besides Neil.
Okay, well, expand.
Well, a lot of people know I had a total of 12 pregnancies, and I have 3 children. And having children was a goal of mine. And I have Elizabeth. All my children were born healthy and well, and they grew up to be the kind of people you want to clone. They are good people. They live Jewish values. I have 2 grandchildren who are just like them. And, I'm bursting with pride because these children are fantastic. Eve is my youngest, and she teaches at Milton Academy in Milton, Mass. And she's also a coach, a national winners. No, she is a coach of rowing crew, and her high schools won 2 or 3 years in a row. The U.S. coaching. One is a psychiatrist. David is a psychiatrist, and he lives on the Upper West Side, but his office is the Upper East Side. And then there's Lizzie, who works for Bloomberg. And a lot of the things that have happened with technology are because she persevered. And someone said Kaufleffel before, she's a stirrer. She stirs things up, and it was marvelous. I do want to say one more thing, though, if you give me, if I can. Please. I don't know what time it is, but I want to just say that ultimately I became part of a group that 36 Holocaust scholars from all over the world, and we were selected. It was a competition, and we meet every other year in an abbey in New York, in England, kind of the Robin Hood country. And these 36 people, and it's been going on for 24 years. We argue for 5 days about what's right, what's wrong, how to do this, how to do that, which books to read, what to teach. And it is a way of sustenance for me, because these people come from everywhere. And we keep in touch. We write books together, and we keep in touch. And it's a marvelous feeling. It's called the Roxton Seminar because we meet in Roxton Abbey, which is something like Downton Abbey, but not as fancy. And it's 13th century, so it's got a lot of history and a lot of knights in armor, armors. Very funny. Anyway, that's it.
Myrna, I've just been trying to unmute. Oh, here we go. We've got David and Liz unmuted, and I can't find number 3 here. But we just wanted to invite you to if you like, your kids, I mean, to say hello.
Thanks for honoring Mom. She's pretty special.
That's Lizzie.
We're so grateful for that. That they're in such a wonderful community. Thank you.
That's David. Okay.
I'm just gonna echo what they said because I'm the youngest and that's all we do.
That's Eve Lisa. Yes. So
Thank you. Thank
I
you
mean,
all.
I'm pretty, Neil and I are pretty blessed, we really are.
Good. Thank you for chiming in. And there's one last question that I'd like to ask, or unless there's something burning that we haven't gotten to that you want to just slip in, but one last question.
No, I talk too much, I know.
No, there's some people who are asking for more time here, although I'm not sure we're going to be able to accommodate that. But so the question that I've asked others here in these conversations is, let me just, before that, you're working on a book. You're working on a book right now, right?
Yes.
Just quickly, it's about what?
It's about Annie Nathan Meyer, who was the Jewish woman who founded Barnard College by going to various rich people, including the Rockefellers, and asking for pledges. She was an autodidact who wanted to go to what was then Columbia. It was a smaller Columbia, a university, and she went to Melville Dewey, and she said, I want to have the same curriculum that you give the boys, I want you to give to me. And he said to her, if you want to go to college, start your own. And she did. And she wasn't acknowledged, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and I wrote a lot about it, and I'm going to put it in my, organize it again, reorganize it so it's not a dissertation, but a book. And I'll write about how hard it was to be a Jew in that era, going to those colleges. It really was. They didn't want Hebrews. That's
We'll look forward to the book and then the movie version of it, of course. And then finally, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you were younger, and you would inform your younger self?
Well, a couple of things. One of them is this too shall pass, not to be so focused and upset about the things you can't change. And I don't know, Neil and I knew you were going to ask me that question, and I'm trying to figure out what I decided I would say. Neil, what did I say? Oh yeah, I try to do a lot. And one of my colleagues said to me in Yiddish, "Kenish tanzen auf an alle chasana." You can't dance at every wedding. Mm-hmm. And what she was saying to me is focus. You can't do everything all at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I wish I believed that when I was doing all that I was doing, because I think that it was hard on my family to have me doing all those things and going all those places. So that's it. But it's important to know what's important and not worry about what's not. It'll go. They'll pass. And I always knew my family was the most important thing to me. And now would you believe that I found cousins in Montgomery County? And they're on this too. And Gordon is a member of Adat Shalom. And I think my cousin Judy is on it too. Judy Gallant, wave. And they live in Montgomery County. And it's a pleasure to have relatives so close. I'm lucky, I told you.
Good. Well, this is wonderful. It's a great place to stop. As I said, it's hard packing 83 years into 40 minutes, 50 minutes, but we've learned a lot, and we really thank you for sharing it. And happy birthday, and happy bat mitzvah. And thanks everybody for being on. We still have a lot of people listening, a lot of great wishes for you, which you probably haven't had a chance to look at. And then we're going to say Kiddush now.
Just
or
before you
Rachel
look
puts
at
it.
it, I'm going to jump in here. I want to thank Jeff Weintraub and Mark Gunther, who have been our two wonderful interviewers for our whole series and have just made this so easy and delicious. And I also want to thank Audrey Lyon, who's hiding there next to Jeff, who's really been the manager of this whole program, working with each of our honorees, helping them get ready, and what a wonderful partner, Audrey. Thank you.
They were helpful to me. They were always there for me. Beautiful.
Yeah,
Good.
they are. That's how they are. So actually, that's the theme I wanted to end on, which is the theme of giving generously of our time and our talent. I've thought, listening to you, Myrna, listening to this amazing story that you've been telling, you know, and you show up at the synagogue regularly to shelve books in the library and keep things organized and make sure that we have the right copies on the shelves and get rid of the ones that we don't need anymore. Really, really ready to roll your sleeves up and do the everyday work. And not for a second putting on any airs saying, well, I have a PhD and I've written several books and I am a professor. I think if someone didn't know that about you, they would just assume you were just an incredibly hardworking, book-loving person, which you also are, and community-loving. And I think that some bit of that is true of all of our honorees. And I just want to name them before we say goodbye today. All 8 of the people who participated this spring in a time when, you know, we've been home and we've been remote from one another. And this has been an incredible chance for us to connect, to learn from each other, to hear stories we wouldn't otherwise have heard. So just one more time, the names of all of our honorees, starting right after Pesach: Joel Bremen, Marie-Jeanne Lambert, Walter Kahn, Jane Handler, Linda Kaxer, John Niles, Myrna Seidman, and of course today, Myrna Goldenberg. And we're so grateful to all of you for sharing your incredible spirit with us and for giving us all the courage to go forward in a season that's not terribly easy. So thank you all so much. And thank you again, Jeff and Mark and Audrey.